Hello and welcome to Bad Art, the world's premier anti-art podcast. I'm Colin McLaughlin-Alcock. I am joined today, as always, by my inimitable co-host, Marielle Grushko.
Hi, I'm Marielle. Welcome to Bad Art.
We also have a special guest on the show today, Nick Sturm. Hi, Nick.
Hi.
It's great to have you with us. Nick recently published an article entitled Good Riddance to the Best American Poetry, which appeared in Defector. It's an awesome article which describes how the poetry anthology, The Best American Poetry, is a reactionary political project shaped by the reactionary agenda of its founder, David Lehman. Nick shows how the best American poetry exerts a negative influence not just on the world of poetry, but on our wider civic and political life. As you can imagine, Marielle and I were super excited to read this article. And we said to each other, oh my God, a kindred spirit. Someone as cynical about poetry as we are about art. And so we are thrilled to have Nick on the show today to tell us why poetry is bad. Just before we get started, Nick Sturm is a teacher and author. He teaches at Georgia State University in Atlanta, and his book, Publishing the New York School, Small Press Communities in American Poetry, will be published by Columbia University Press. Nick is also in the research stage of another book-length project, The Poetry Business, which examines the role of the state, nonprofits, universities, and philanthropy in the professionalization of American poetry. Nick also has several other publications. We'll put those in the show notes for people to check out. So, Nick, we're thrilled to have you on the show. Welcome to Bad Art.
Yeah, thank you so much, Colin, Mariel. It's so fun to be here. I was really excited, Colin, when you invited me to be on the show after reading my Defector piece. I listened to the first episode right away, and you were both talking about Confederate statuary, and I was so thrilled because I started my academic career as a history major, was trained as a historian, and wrote my senior paper on a Civil War statue for the state of Ohio in the World's Fair. So just felt close to the arguments you were making. And it makes perfect sense that I would be here talking to you about poetry because while I was also writing that paper about Civil War statuary, I was also finishing my undergraduate thesis on American Cold War aesthetic politics in American poetry. So it's all come full circle.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking about how these are two historical moments that for people who have not studied them very closely feel very far apart, right? As if the spirit of the times were quite different. And yet, as I'm sure you found when you were writing the thesis and this paper simultaneously, there's so much that marries them together.
Yeah, that's right. And we might even get into a particular instance of how close the failure of Reconstruction and the production of American literature in the mid 20th century is, but I'll leave that for
Ooh.
Yeah, I
later.
am very excited. So we're gonna we're
Yes,
gonna bookmark
we are
that.
officially intrigued. Good work, Nick.
So to get us started, we wanted to talk a little bit about your Defector piece. One of the things that you claim is that the popular anthology series, The Best American Poetry, is a reactionary political project shaped by the vision of its reactionary founder, David Lehman. Could you tell us a little bit about the Best American Poetry series and Lehman's influence on it?
So David Lehman is the series editor of the Best American Poetry, and he founds the project in 1988, and he functions as the series editor continuously through the most recent volume in 2025, which is the final iteration of the series. So
Good
it ran
riddance.
Good Riddance, which is a title that was added on, by the Defector publishing by their editorial board, which I thought was great. It was a little bit more polemical than I wanted to be, but you know, but so it's published continuously for 38 years and resulted in 40 volumes. So there was a yearly anthology that David Lehman would choose the guest editor for each year. And those guest editors were always well-known, prize-winning American poets. Lehman would describe them as euphonical. That was his favorite descriptor for his guest editor's disposition. Whether or not that is true is worthy of putting some pressure on. And there's a lot of different kinds of poetry anthologies. There are the Norton anthologies that are familiar to a lot of English majors. There are one-off anthologies that are interventions and contemporary or historical canons. But the best American poetry is really, really unique because it doesn't do either of those things. It kind of operates like this annual prize, skimming off what it claims are the best American poems published in that year. What else makes the best American poetry so unique compared to similar anthology series is that Lehman writes the way that this project reflects his aesthetic and political worldview is through the introductions that he writes to each
Mm.
year's anthology. It's the place where he sort of puts his hand on the project and says what's going on here, what his intent is. And it's important to emphasize again that there's something, at times it does feel narcissistic. He does repeatedly tie the project back to himself in ways that are kind of startling. But one way that we can see his valuation of his own participation in the project is that he doesn't just take the prestige that comes along with being the series editor of one of the most popular anthology series of the 20th and 21st centuries. He also decides twice in the span of the anthology series to collect his forewords as separate books.
Oh, wow.
So in so the first one is called State of the Union, which
What a
that's
title.
loaded, right? I'm sorry, State of the Art. State of the Art.
That's somehow even more loaded. That's incredible.
And that collects all of his forewords from 1988 through 2015, packaged with an introduction by a poet that is very fond of him and his work, who calls him the most important contemporary tastemaker in American poetry. And then just recently, he collected all of the subsequent forewords to the best American poetry in a book called The Birth of the Best, where he gives this sort of narrative of the anthology's inception and then includes all of his other forewords. And that gesture of anthologizing, or collecting your own forewords to the anthology is a way I think Lehman is telling us this is a really intentional project, and I want you to read these as like my critical message here.
That's really interesting.
And the fact that one actor is the architect of this 40-year project is kind of astounding in its own right. And no one had kind of diagnosed or asked, why is this the case for this particular anthology series? And what's going on with this editor and his political grievances?
Right. It's, when we think of anthologies, especially these best American anthologies, we think of an expansive view of whatever it is that they're anthologizing. But behind the curtain, best American poetry turns out to be the narrow and small world of poetry as seen by one particular person. I mean, it sounds that way to me. I don't know if you would agree, Nick.
Yeah, and I guess, like even the way that Colin, you introduced your excitement about wanting to talk with me about this Defector piece, I was a little bit like, what did you just say about me being cynical about poetry? And I really have no cynicism about all of this. I fully believe in poetry as a social, political, cultural project, and its historical relevance. So I really want to be clear that I'm not coming at this series of questions about the best American poetry from a place of trying to diminish poetry further. And there's an easy way to read the piece, and it has been sort of read in a kind of armchair way as, well, if the best American poetry is a vehicle for circulating more poetry, we have to assume that that's a good thing, and it must be true that some of them are the best, even if some of them suck. like, why attack this anthology series? Like, what's the point of that, especially for a genre that's supposedly so esoteric and so hard to understand and so intimidating and so irrelevant? So just to,
Yeah.
put that
Yeah.
out there.
So,
No, yeah. And just to be clear, I think to those naysayers, and I don't know if we wanted to talk about the naysayers of the piece now, or maybe it makes sense to put this a little bit later after we've talked about the piece. But, you know, I imagine that you would say, or I don't know if you would say this, but the point isn't whether the poems in the collection are good or bad, right? That's sort of beside the point of the argument that you're making.
That's right. Yeah, I'm really not even interested necessarily in the particular poems that are in the best American poetry. And my argument is it's not about the poets themselves or their individual poems, but about this container, this this thing that they're collected in and which circulates these other ideas.
stepping back a minute, I was I was going to say, don't tell the listeners, but Mariel and I both are believers in art as well. We just,
Well, it's so funny. I mean, I also had sort of a knee-jerk reaction, Colin, to your intro, because I kept wanting to reach out and clarify, we view art cynically because we are such strong believers in it that we get really down when we see others
yeah.
being cynical about art
But I
or
mean,
using art cynically.
but maybe on that note, Nick, before we really dive into all of the problems with Lehman, you could tell us a little bit about why you're a believer in poetry and what you have hopes for with it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like I said, in my undergraduate career, even as a historian, I was in English classes and was just really energized by what it meant to think interdisciplinary, in interdisciplinary ways across disciplines of English and history. And that led me to get an MFA in creative writing and then to get a PhD in English. And um, thinking about how to answer this question, why do I believe in poetry? That's such a crazy question. Um, it's such a deeply insane question. Um, it's something like, okay, let me think for a second. There's a quote by Hannah Arendt where she says, "Of all things of thought, poetry is closest to thought." And I really like to carry that to students and share it with them because I think students come to poetry with a certain sense that this is not a literary space for them unless they already have some like idiosyncratic predisposition to like poetry. And I want students to understand that poetry is, like Arendt is suggesting, a kind of way of tracking the architecture and substance of thought itself. And that as a genre, it has that kind of capacity to merge imagination and critical thinking in ways that are extremely capacious and productive. And I think that's like at the heart of why I so organically believe in American poetry. I mean, in poetry as a genre, it's just this continuously productive space that resists categorization as a genre and as like a kind of intellectual activity.
That's lovely.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah, go ahead.
sold.
Yeah, me
No, that
Okay.
too.
was it.
I'm really glad I asked you that question, actually. I think that brings something to the table. So, do you think that America's best poetry reflects that vision of the things that poetry can achieve in any way?
No, the best American poetry. Yeah, it's definitely something else. I think that the Arendt quote is like orienting us toward in poetry as an interdisciplinary intellectual activity that has really important aesthetic elements. And I think also ethical elements. And the vision that Lehman has for American poetry is a deeply moral one. Lehman has a set of interlocking projects that lead to the Best American Poetry anthology series. So maybe it's worth sort of unpacking like that background, how he gets to the Best American Poetry anthology series, because it's not inevitable necessarily. So Lehman starts his career as a kind of traditional academic. I mean, he gets a tenure track job in the early 1980s, or maybe it's important to sort of rewind even farther because that sets the stage for his sort of critical disposition. So when Lehman is younger, in the late 60s and early 70s, he is a poet in New York City. And he is a student of a poet named Kenneth Koch, who is a teacher at Columbia. And Kenneth Koch is also known as one of the original poets who's affiliated with this group or category of American poets called the New York School of Poets. So Lehman has this direct pedagogical student-teacher relationship with Koch. And at the same time, Lehman is also nursing, this is in the 1970s, Lehman's nursing a fondness for a well-known literary critic named Harold Bloom. And Bloom is most well known for a book that he publishes in the 1970s called The Anxiety of Influence, where he's making this argument about how influence functions in American poetry. And the prized poet for Bloom is another New York School poet named John Ashbery. And Bloom's argument about Ashbery is that, and this argument is emblematic of Bloom's approach in his thesis in The Anxiety of Influence, which is that poets are always going through a kind of like psychological turmoil with the terms of their aesthetics and inheritance, and they misrecognize their inheritance. Like as they try to work through a lineage, they misrecognize it, and then they produce their own kind of originality as a synthesis of this battle with the past. And for Bloom, John Ashbery, who in the 1970s is a really radically experimental poet, but in 1975 he wins the what's called the Triple Crown. It's like the three big annual book awards are all won by the first person for the first time. This never happens again, actually.
Wow.
So Ashbery sort of rockets to prominence on this Triple Crown. And Bloom's argument with Ashbery is that Ashbery's experimentalism, the radical fracturing of his poetry, this imaginative lift, is tied back to Wallace Stevens, who's a famous American modernist poet. And that, for a lot of readers, it's true in a certain extent. Like Ashbery does pull on Stevens, but one of the things that Bloom gets out of making that connection between those two poets is that Stevens was deeply committed to poetry as solely an aesthetic project. And he said some really direct things about poetry never needing to be in the service of politics or social aims. Stevens' poems are extremely kind of like ethereal, imaginative. They're weird, and there's a kind of this like this is a simplest. This is flattening it a little bit, but an art for art's sake kind of disposition. And so you get Lehman affiliated with Koch, then you get Lehman's fascination with Bloom, who has another New York School poet, Ashbery, as part of his canon. And there's this way in which Lehman becomes like really, really engaged in the idea of the New York School. And even just to get into the weeds with it, like in 1972, Lehman publishes an omnibus review in Poetry magazine called The Whole School. And he's reviewing like a dozen books by younger New York School poets. So not books by Koch or Ashbery or Frank O'Hara or James Schuyler, who like are the Fab Four kind of the New York school, like the canonical four white men. He's reviewing books by younger poets who have sort of inherited this tradition. And Lehman, who's like very young in 1972, I think he's like in his early 20s, he just like really polemically is like, everyone is in a very Bloomian way. He says all of these poets are misrecognizing their inheritance. They're doing it in a bad way. And we shouldn't really think of these poets as being part of the New York school. We should think of them as, he calls them the Lower East Side group of poets. He turns them into a kind of neighborhood phenomenon in Manhattan.
I assume
And
there's
so
an intended pejorative to that, the shrinking
it's
from New York to Lower East Side.
very much so, yeah. It's a kind of reduction. He kind of sees them as they're overly unserious and they're too much of a coterie. And he says that he can't tie them to the kind of traditions of greatness that he sees Ashbery, Koch, O'Hara, and Schuyler as embodying. So you can see like Lehman from a very early moment is interested in a canonizing function and in sorting out poets for various purposes. The New York School is really where he starts that practice.
So why is this next generation not great in his opinion?
Yeah. So the New York School is unique in categories of post-war American poetry because it has this generational structure to it. We scholars and the poets themselves talk about a first generation, second generation, even a third. It's one of the things that my first book, Publishing the New York School, is working against because this generational label is a way, it looks like a way of effectively sorting poets based on ideas of inheritance, and it makes ideas of who comes after sound like a natural series of like familial progressions. Um, but in practice, what this ends up looking like are literary scholars and critics elevating the first generation as like more aesthetically potent and important than a imitative and secondary second generation. Like coming after always sort of lessens you. And the second generation, quote unquote, New York School poets are more aesthetically various. I mean, they're pulling from other lineages, so they're pulling from the like original New York School poets, I guess you could say, but also Black Mountain poets and beat poets and Black Arts, San Francisco Renaissance, all of these big categorizations that come out of American poetry after World War II.
Maybe this is overreading what you said a little bit, and feel free to push back. But coming from an anthropology background, I can't help but hear some, like almost some biological essentialism to the way that people have thought about these generations of poets, these racial feeling anxieties about the dilution of the core essence of an art form just feel eerily familiar to what we get from race scientists in like the 19th and 20th centuries.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, one of the ways that I use this sociologist who has this idea he calls about generational thinking, and that generational thinking is a kind of novel framework in the 20th and 21st century for describing broad social and political change in the absence of like stable class-based relationships.
Hmm.
And like, I mean, I think we can really see this in our contemporary moment with our obsessions with like being millennial or being Gen Z or being Gen X, right? Like boomer, like all of that stuff. And but in literary spaces, we also have like a kind of like generations is a pretty common framework. You think of the lost generation, and also the beat generation. So
I mean, to be clear though, and maybe this is my own ignorance, but when I think about the lost generation or the beat generation, there is that concept of generations, but not the concept of descent, which feels like the new thing that is happening with the New York school is that it's for it sounds like the first time in American poetry, it's no longer just, or in American literature, but it sounds like the difference between the New York school and something like the Lost Generation or the Beat Generation is that it's generation plus descent. And I'm wondering, you know, from what you've told us about Harold Bloom's work, he treats that notion of descent and inheritance in what sounds like a very generous way, where, yes, artists have anxieties about what their inheritance is, but they're able to marshal those toward creativity. And as you've already noted, Lehman's project is much more about policing what should be inherited, what should be inheritable, what those boundaries are on the bloodline that is passed down.
And opposition, it sounds like, to contamination, like you listed some of the other genres that they're drawing on. That's like this is fouling the purity of this aesthetic form.
Yeah, well, actually, and we shouldn't let Bloom off in the way that you characterized it,
I
Mariel,
would
because
never I would never want to let Harold Bloom off the hook, to be clear.
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah,
Tell us why not.
yeah, I would say Bloom is certainly not generous. What is the opposite of being generous? I'm being a raging racist, like he is. I mean, he is extremely concerned, Bloom, in the 1970s and the 1980s about, to use the word that Colin, you just said, contamination of American poetry. And Bloom is really, really concerned that literary theory and that identity politics, feminism, race, gender, that all of these are categories are becoming the ways that we frame the importance of literature. And Bloom is very forcefully fighting that neoconservative fight as a liberal, in much the same way that Lehman does. And we should add another figure. So we have a kind of trifecta here. So we have Lehman, we have Bloom, and then we also need to add Lionel Trilling. And Lionel Trilling is a member of the New York intellectuals, mid-century American, largely literary critics, who played really important roles in constructing the cultural landscape during the early Cold War. And Lehman has a personal connection to Trilling because he was his assistant late in Trilling's life. And one of the animating forces for Lionel Trilling in the 1940s and 1950s is the production of a liberal anti-communism. And alongside Trilling's anti-communism, there's also a strain of anti-modernism. I know you guys have talked about anti-modernism on the podcast before. And Trilling isn't so much actually an anti-modernist as he is invested, like many mid-century liberal anti-communists were, in producing a version of literary modernity which is canonizable and usable for the Cold War present. So there's a kind of taming of the radical experimentation and fragmentation of literary modernism by a lot of mid-century actors. And Lehman learns a lot from that kind of gesture. And he also, I think, is extremely fond of Trilling's worldview and its need for like a big boogeyman. So like I think Lehman sees this as a kind of heroic position from which to act as a cultural administrator. But he doesn't have communism in the 1970s and 80s in the same form that Trilling does. So he replaces it with literary theory, this sort of boogeyman that someone like Bloom is also really invested in attacking and working against.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Because when I hear you say the boogeyman used to be communism and now it's literary theory, my brain goes, wait a minute, one of these things is not like the other. And yet it sounds like to Bloom
Literary
and to
theory will
Lehman.
cover the world.
Yeah, yeah.
The theorists of the world rise up, and you have nothing to lose but your chains.
It's
Sorry,
like so,
go
no,
ahead.
no, no,
No,
no, it's perfect. No, I think I see what you're saying. If so, it's like, and actually they're not so different, you know. So I could tell you how there's continuity there from this anti-communism to this anti-literary theory position.
Yes, I think
And
that's the piece that's missing for me. Yeah.
okay, so let me zoom in on that for a second. So when we think of like the Red Scare post World War II, we often think of it in terms of like people getting blacklisted, like Hollywood actors, popular culture, and how communism circulates through space, supposedly. But one of the most forceful spaces in American culture where the Red Scare functions is in higher education. Yeah, so there's a kind of like political cleansing of higher education during the Red Scare and during the House Un-American Activities Committee. And there's total continuity from that moment to the campus panic of the 1980s and the early 1990s. And the campus panic was about any number of different kinds of boogeymans that act in the same way that communism did for mid-century liberals, whether that's feminism, whether that's gay rights, or whether it's a this French literary theory that called deconstruction, which is trying to, in the view of these campus panic actors, they are imagining deconstruction as breaking down the foundations of Western civilization because it's calling into question hierarchies of greatness, these kind of natural binaries of good and evil, right or wrong, and throwing everything into a kind of endless loop of uncertainty that is fundamentally nihilistic and fundamentally un-American in some way. And Lehman is part of this campus panic moment in the 1980s. And the book that he publishes, which is his campus panic book, is called Signs of the Times: Deconstruction and the Fall of Paul de Man. Paul de Man is one of the most well-known deconstructionist theorists. And Lehman, he attacks deconstruction and literary theory because he says the real culture war is the fight for the war of literary survival. So he's really taking this whole tradition, this like reactionary tradition, and he's putting it in direct conversation with the history of American poetry because he needs he needs this kind of story where there's this evil force at work that is threatening American poetry. And we need a kind of a restoration of the genre. We need to bring it back to a kind of greatness. And which sounds a lot like
Make poetry great
contemporary.
again. Yes.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
hard not to like end up at that phrase.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you had more to say there or not, but you mentioned that you were interested in talking about this campus panic and deconstruction in and literary theory. And one thing that's really stood out to me, I think it's interesting to me that one of the things that the contemporary right does so today is they often talk about Foucault and deconstruction and
Mm.
like I think they're called radical Marxists, which isn't quite right, but they have a warped idea of what literary theory does, and like Jordan Peterson, so one of the right's so-called intellectuals, will rant about Foucault in these like very long, incoherent online lectures, but that give like this idea that this is actually the enemy. The enemy is that the kids in college are getting these Marxist and critical race theory ideas through some kind of literary theory, and that's still today what many aspects of the Trumpist right are fighting against. So I heard a weird continuity there that I wasn't
Yeah.
expecting.
The other really striking element of the history that you've narrated for us is the way in which already in the liberal anti-communist era, where the big bad was communism, in practice, that battle was not waged as an international battle, right? It was waged as a workplace struggle over spoils to push out the people with the quote unquote bad ideologies so that you could take their sinecures, their positions of power.
Mm.
And that feels like that process that started with HUAC has just continued to the present day with different figures coming in and identifying what is the bad ideology with which to prosecute basically their workplace rivals. And so you see that too in Lehman, first with the New York School and then later with the crusade against literary theory as well.
Yeah, I think I can try and like weave together both of your comments in one continuation of this discussion.
Great.
So there, one thing that's important here is, well, let's bring in this question of professionalization. This is a big part of my argument in the Defector piece, is that even though Lehman doesn't use this word in his forewords to the Best American Poetry anthology series, that professionalization is what drives this project. And so, what is professionalization broadly, right? It's the production of educational pathways for credentialing in a field, it's particular kinds of shared expertise, standards, and channels of success. And it's also in academia how our disciplines are produced as a professional space. And we're talking about two things here overall, right? One part is literary criticism, and the other is American poetry. And literary criticism is professionalized in the 1930s and 40s. So, I mean, like many of our humanistic disciplines, it has a kind of a shorter lifespan than we might imagine. And literary criticism is professionalized in the 30s and 40s by this group of poet critics that are called the New Critics. And they're pulling from people like T.S. Eliot, I.A. Richards, and the New Critics are very explicit that they have a kind of scientific business project for literary criticism. They want to make literary criticism, they want to take it away from the philologists and the historians and make it a science. And so in the 1930s, John Crowe Ransom, who's one of the leading New Critics, publishes an essay called Criticism, Inc., where he lays out the terms of what new criticism will be. There's a whole group of other poet critics, all of them were at Vanderbilt. And before they had this new critical project, they were a group of Southern agrarians. That's what they called themselves, Southern agrarians. And the Southern agrarians
I've
didn't
heard
have
those words before. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, so they didn't have a specific literary project necessarily, but they were very much a kind of they were publishing these essays. They were thinking about a kind of like it was a lost cause kind of redemption narrative. They were really interested in this vision of like Southern pastoralism that erases all of the economic violence of slavery and resists the modernization, increasing technological alienation of the modern world by returning us to these kind of like utopian agrarian conditions. When they produced their version of literary criticism, and I'm not the one to imagine this transference, but this is what happens, is this kind of utopian idea of American society free from the pressures of the economy, of politics, of social change, moves from an imagined redemptive South into the space of the literary text itself. So
Oh,
poems should be read, right? So poems, according to the New Critics, should be read as self-contained aesthetic spaces where politics, society, history, biographical considerations of the poet are irrelevant. It's a kind of
mm.
dramatic, tense little box, the text itself. What this ends up doing, like by professionalizing literary criticism, is that suddenly this is how English departments function after the 1930s and 40s, is through this kind of new critical practice. And they publish a lot of pedagogical anthologies, the most famous of which is called Understanding Poetry, which becomes like the most widely taught poetry textbook of the 20th century.
So do all these English departments essentially imagine themselves to be doing new criticism after a certain point?
I'm not sure if they would say directly. I mean, there's a scholar named Andy Hines actually who has a book called Outside Literary Studies, which corrects a little bit of our assumptions that new criticism was that it homogenized all university English departments
Mm.
because there are a lot of alternative institutions and there's a lot of contemporary resistance to new criticism. Um, but new criticism seeps into the fabric of the discipline itself and really becomes kind of ubiquitous to the point where it becomes hard to disambiguate its effects from other kinds of, historical trajectories for the discipline.
So I have a question then. Let me see if I'm reading this right. So the new critics, drawing on their Southern agrarian tradition, set up poetry and literature as like a pure aesthetic object that's bounded from the outside considerations of all the things that divide us. And then sometime in the late 70s, critical theory shows up and reads those things back in. So here's, the colonial influence on Bronte, right? Like here's the way that race and slavery play into this text that we assume is neutral. And so I can easily see why to someone who has a strong belief in the purity of the aesthetic that becomes like a radical assault on their idea of what poetry and literature are.
That's right. Yeah.
Can we just sit for a moment with this earlier moment? Because there's somewhere else that I want to take it.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah.
Um, so, it's really striking to me. You use this word transference to describe the movement of this group of Vanderbilt academics from self-identifying as Southern agrarians to self-identifying as the new critics. It sort of sounds to me like this attempt at purifying the American South, at turning it into a utopian project, came to be unsustainable because of the political, economic, and social realities of life in the South at that point in time. There's a certain point at which you can make any number of claims as an academic essayist, but people can look around them at a shared reality and see the flaws in what you are proposing. There's this way in which the move from physical reality to literature and language seems to open up a space for this purification process to not run into as many troubling realities.
Mm.
I'm thinking about how linguistic anthropologists who have studied how languages evolve talk about similar processes of purification. So a classic example that I'm more familiar with is the purification of Catalan in the 20th century. So Catalan is a Romance language. It shares roots with Italian, with French, with Spanish, with Portuguese, with all of these different languages of Southern Europe. And most significantly, Catalan is spoken within the borders of the Spanish nation state. And after the Spanish Civil War, when Franco is the dictator of Spain, he bans the use of the Catalan language in public. It's not allowed to be taught in schools. It's not allowed to be, if you are gathering in groups of more than 3 people, that's considered a public gathering where you're not allowed to speak it. And of course, eventually, as the Catalan nationalist movement gains steam in the second half of the 20th century, it is able to reclaim the Catalan language and begin its own institution building project with this language. And one of the things that happens during that institutionalization of Catalan is that as the language is normalized with dictionary projects, with school texts, the Spanish influences on Catalan are purified out of the language. So if you look at 19th century Catalan grammar books, a lot of linguistic forms that they consider perfectly grammatical and perfectly Catalan come to be understood by the late 20th, the early 21st century as forms of Catalan that have been contaminated by Spanish, that the Spanish has to be purged to create a more linguistically pure form of the Catalan language. There's a certain way in which language, whether that's grammar, vocabulary, literature, really lends itself to these projects of purification because it can appear as a self-contained system of signs, right? Which is kind of the deconstructivist approach to language, right? But it seems that the fact that, in fact, language often is a self-contained system of signs is actually one of the enabling conditions for these projects of purification. So
Hmm.
I don't know. That was a rant. I don't know if anyone wants to take it up, but
I mean, that was incredible to listen to. I mean, I completely agree with you, but the purification narrative is exactly right. And there's a racial context to what Lehman is doing as well, very clearly by inheriting this tradition.
I was going to ask if you wanted to tell us how this ideology leads into the best American poetry. So how does it show up in the collection itself?
Sure, yes. So one of the claims that I make in the Defector piece is that the best American poetry is the epitome of a commercial literary anthology, and that it does what it does as a commercial literary anthology is it produces this idea of the mainstream. And it does it in such a way that it serves Lehman's larger genre containment project for poetry. So Lehman really wants to extend this tamed version of American poetry. And there's also this other thing that has to do with the professionalization of creative writing as a discipline as well. So following the professionalization of literary criticism in the 30s and 40s, creative writing is developed and solidified as a discipline in the 60s and 1970s. So Lehman has got a kind of framework from the professionalization of literary criticism. He wants to be a main actor in reinforcing it in creative writing as a discipline.
are the as the creative writers are being professionalized, are they writing for the new critics, right? Are they writing for this receptive academic kind of audience, this critical audience, or are they writing for some broader public that they imagine that is defined more by commercialization and by markets?
That's a really good question. We could simplify it and say that there's a kind of binary going on, that there's a kind of alternative, countercultural, experimental side, and that there's a more conventional, traditional, uh, and traditionally formal side. Robert Lowell, for instance, would be emblematic of the latter. He's a prized student of the new critics who becomes one of the most well-known American poets of the 20th century. Deeply, deeply formal poet, narrative, lyric, eye-based, psychological kind of confessional drama on the page, and very legible in that way. But one of the mechanisms that professionalizes American poetry starting in the 1960s is actually the state through the National Endowment for the Arts.
Hmm.
So the National Endowment for the Arts now just celebrated its 60th anniversary. But in the 1960s and 70s, when this new federal agency is trying to get off of the ground, it has a lot of money to push out the door to different artistic disciplines. And the NAA is organized by disciplines. So there's the literature program, there's the visual arts program, music, dance, theater, media arts, and so on. And in some disciplines like theater, dance, visual art, these are already professionalized fields with very strong nonprofit service organizations and existing philanthropic networks. Literature, on the other hand, is deeply under-professionalized in the 1960s. There are some MFA programs in creative writing. They've been around since the 1930s. Iowa is the most famous MFA program, famous to the extent even that Lena Dunham goes to Iowa for her MFA in girls.
I
HB.
really enjoyed that arc on girls, gotta say.
Yeah, it's for us in the field, it is funny. It's deeply funny. So the NEA has these increasing budgets year on year from the 1960s to 1970s. It's what I call the era of growth in the NEA. And so this federal agency really wants to push money out the door to literature, but it doesn't have a lot of ways to do it because there's no one to receive the money. So the NEA in the 1960s and 70s does a lot of like experimental institution building in literature as a field, like in creative writing specifically. And and especially for poetry, more so even than fiction or nonfiction, because those genres have existing commercial spaces. So, like, they're popular, they sell. So, poetry develops all of this kind of infrastructure through the being subsidized by the state. But when Reagan is elected president in 1980, there is all of this signaling from the right that the NEA is going to be um, reframed. The Heritage Foundation, which we know today as the origin of Project 2025, is very invested in the destruction of the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities.
One thing Marielle and I have traced a little bit, but not as much as I'd like to, but just how in the Reagan era, as you're saying, you know, the NEA was a convenient target because they could say, "Oh, we don't like the political project that's being sponsored, but also like this is obscene, but also this is wasteful. Like, why is the government spending money on this?" So it was a very easy target for the Reagan administration to say government funding is wasteful. We'll take out the NEA, and meanwhile, we'll also take out the air traffic administration. You know, like these two things became part of the same waste, and so arts was a convenient target not just for art, but as a like leading edge of a wider reactionary project. Um,
Yeah.
and I think it's interesting. Like I hear a lot of what you're saying in that. Like there's a reason that the Reagan administration's attack on the NEA coincide with Lehman's reactionary projects.
Yes, because if we go back again to like, let's say that the literary field is divided in, again, very a rough way into these two segments, one which is more traditional and conventional, and one which is alternative, experimental, countercultural. The NEA does a lot of work across its first 20 years of building a lot of infrastructure for the countercultural, alternative, small press, independent publishing side of things, which is all a nonprofit sector. But with Reagan, there's the downturn. There's the flattening of funding and then the downturn. And so when Lehman starts the anthology project, The Best American Poetry in 1988, it's at the confluence of this deep disinvestment in the literary arts by the state, which had been supporting this
Mm.
one segment of poets that I think someone like Lehman is sort of happy to see be pushed to the side.
So if I have this correct, Lehman's project, his anti-literary theory, purification of poetry project, he's able to set that into motion at precisely the moment when these more experimental, radical poetic institutions are being decimated and torn apart.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And it's also a moment in 1988 where the rise of MFA programs in creative writing housed inside the neoliberal American university have really, really consolidated control over creative writing as a discipline. It's also a few years before the end of the Cold War. Lehman frames his anthology and like the opening forward to the first edition as like this is about the freedom of the individual writer, very much like a Cold War sort of
Yeah.
position. And I just to go back to this for a second to tie back to the New York School and see some continuity in Lehman's canon making project. The one thing he does to these four principal members of the New York School that he is heroically attached to is rather than thinking of them as a community of poets, um, he really intentionally constructs them as individual geniuses. And that is
Hmm.
so much a part of his anthology project. Because I, as a scholar, am really interested in how publishing and categorization are processes that produce the field itself. But I'm interested in publishing and categorization in ways that give elasticity to these group formations. Like if we look at small press publishing, we can see all of the practitioners who are beyond the horizon of the canonical that actually did material work, making little magazines, writing for underground newspapers, producing countercultural radio programming that made these groups coherent. And Lehman wants to separate out the top layer and say, this is what poetry is. And just to like attach this to how the best American poetry is actually edited, because I didn't talk about this in the Defector piece, and I think it is an important part of understanding the anthology project. So the best American poetry is, as I said, edited by a different poet every year. What Lehman does is, and he talks about this indirectly sometimes. So the guest editor is given all of these magazines that are published during that calendar year. And the best American poetry is only pulling from periodicals. So it could be magazines, university journals, online journals later in the 90s and the 21st century. And they're not reading individual books of poems. So none of the poems in best American poetry are coming from collections of poetry, just
Yeah.
from these magazines. And it's important to say, like, this is obvious, but like the best American poetry doesn't actually produce anything new. None of the best American anthology series produce anything new. What they're doing is republishing pieces that have been published in magazines that year. And what's important about that is that no one submits their poems to the best American poetry. But because this is a commercial anthology project, it wants to replicate versions of American poetry that fit into all the kind of aesthetic political categories that we've been describing. And the poems that best fit into those political and aesthetic categories are ones that are already commercially successful. So they're the ones that are going to be published in the most mainstream, accessible journals and magazines. And so while it's true that no one submits their poems to the best American poetry, as I point out in the article, 20% of the poems in the 40 years of the anthology come from 5 publications. So in a sense, if you were to submit your poems to one of those 5 publications, Poetry Magazine, The New Yorker, American Poetry Review, Plowshares, the Paris Review, you are in a way submitting your poem for consideration in the best American poetry. And there is something about that mechanism that has a kind of, I call it in the essay, a kind of poetry's corporate shine, where this focus on professional success that's narrowed down to the highest forms of cultural capital is a deeply like unsettling way of thinking about the field of American poetry. And it's a deeply neoliberal position from which to look at success. And we can tie these two things together, like neoliberalism and the production of the mainstream, because, what is neoliberalism? It is this belief that the free market naturally sorts out what's good and bad, what's successful and unsuccessful, and that the free market drives progress. So like this logic of how the free market sorts out what's good and bad, what works and doesn't work, and then this editorial process where we kind of trust the literary marketplace to give us the best poems in the best journals, and then skim off an even thinner layer of that and then put it in the best American poetry anthology. It's just the epitome of concepts of cultural capital. And I would just like bracket that by saying like, okay, like all art making and art reception has cultural capital baked into it. But there are ways that we can participate in cultural capital that aren't just completely fixated on success. And I've seen this in my own experience in my graduate program in creative writing. There was a poetry workshop where what we did in that poetry writing workshop was read all of the books that were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry that year. And the conversation we had after reading the books was, why do you think that this book was a finalist? And why do you think that that book won? Where the like the explicit logic is just like you should be duplicating these conditions.
That's so
Wow.
funny because of the generational stuff. Like it's the inverse. It's because you were saying earlier the generation is like the decay of the form. Each generation is less in their view, but here you are being trained to be influenced in precisely this way, even without anxiety, to just be like, this is what's successful. This is how I get influenced by it in order to be a successful artist.
Yeah, yeah.
There's there's also something striking about these layers of decontextualization that you're describing. So when a poem is submitted to, let's say, one of these five journals that produce the 20% of poems that have been published in the collection, there's somewhat of a decontextualizing move there, right? Where this whole community that has given rise to this poem is erased by the concept of a single author, right? But then when whoever the editor is of that year's edition volume of the best American poetry, when they then swoop in and they skim off the cream from all of these different publications, there's an additional layer of decontextualization that happens, right? And for, let's say, not someone who has been professionalized into this world of poetry, but for your commercial book buying public that just picks up this book, it seems like the most straightforward thing in the world to open this collection and see a collection, an anthology of poems by individuals that came from nowhere except the unique genius of each of these people. And it seems to me that that decontextualizing move can only ever coexist uncomfortably with the professionalization of the field, because what is professionalization? I mean, you told us already, it's so many things, but one of the things that professionalization is the creation of a community with shared aesthetic values, right? So how can there be such a community when at the same time the move of the anthology is to decontextualize any particular poem from away from the grasp of that community? And gosh, that makes me also think like, oh yeah, neoliberalism really is opposed to community in all of its forms.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. That's right. Just you're completely correct about the anthology's function in that way, like the idea of connectivity it produces. Because if we go back to what I said about the quote from Hannah Arendt, like I think Arendt is thinking from a very ethical position when she's thinking of poetry as thought. And again, Lehman is thinking from a moral position. And so it really serves Lehman to atomize everybody rather than putting them in a kind of communal space in which there would be ethical relationships where we would literally face one another.
It's just interesting. Like I heard you say this about atomization, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like the
Mhm.
poems in the anthology aren't really in conversation with each other even most of the time. They're just like a series of poems, but it's not like if you read the Norton anthology, it's like this poem and this poem are examples of a style. This poem and this poem, like there's a bit more of like an effort to tell a narrative through the anthology
That's
versus
right.
this is like a series of poems that are each independent.
Yeah, I think one of the things I have a kind of pedagogical and critical and personal discomfort with anthologies like the Best American Poetry that only include one poem by each writer.
Mm.
Like that's part of Mariel with this decontextualization that you're talking about. It really encourages us as readers to see what poets do as individual great poems. And one of the recurring mottos of the best American poetry for Lehman is that his anthologies include poems of the greatest diversity consistent with the highest quality. It's one of his most repeated phrases. It's crucial to articulating the purpose of his larger project. And as I said in the essay, the best American poetry is nominally really inclusive and diverse, even if a high percentage of the poems in the best American poetry come from a set of something like 85 poets. I think contribute something like 40% of the poems in the 40 years of the anthology, that there is a kind of version of inclusivity and diversity. So, for instance, there are poets like Alice Notley and Nathaniel Mackey and Harriet Mullen who are repeatedly included in the best American poetry over time, like 5, 6, 7, 8 times. All three of the poets that I just named are really like pretty radically experimental American poets, really focused on questions of race, of gender, of breaking power dynamics. And they write long poems, series of poems, just like that are transformational aesthetic projects with political dimensions that are very explicit. So we see those poems, poets by those poems, like come into the Best American Poetry Anthology. So even if you had like a kind of view of the field where you're like, oh, I open an edition of the Best American Poetry and I see Harriet Mullen, Alice Notley, Nathaniel Mackey, this seems pretty inclusive. Like, yeah, these poets are here. But again, the anthology series, by definition, is pulling poems from the most traditional conventional spaces. So the poems by those poets that are under that rubric eligible to be in the anthology series are going to be the most tame, excerptable, legible, canonizable versions of those poets' work. And even if you did find a formally inventive, radical avant garde poem in the Best American Poetry Anthology series, it's one of 2,850 poems alongside of it that counter the power of that poem in its resistance to that more kind of legible mainstream quality. So, you know, in other
Right. It's a,
words, the greatest diversity consistent with the highest quality is bullshit.
yeah. Well, and I'm just thinking about the reader experience. You encounter this one poem that is different from all the others. You're like, well, that was weird. Turns page. You're right.
Yeah,
It completely saps the poem of, not all power that it might hold, but some of the power that it might otherwise have held.
it turns it into an outlier. Yeah.
Oh,
Suddenly,
go ahead.
I just wanted to say now I like totally understand what you mean by the production of the mainstream, that even though this collection, this anthology includes all kinds of poems, it is the production of those poems as outliers to whatever the mainstream is that is being anthologized.
Yeah. And that's really similar to, again, how mid-century anti-communists, anti-modernists produce a version of modernism that is acceptable for their political and social projects.
So, yeah, on that note, I wanted to ask you about I guess, the outlier in the 40 anthologies. I think it's in
Yes.
1996.
I'm so
Adrian
curious about
Rich
this too.
published a version that's widely regarded as like the feminist and radical version of the best American poetry, and there's a number of controversies around it. Could you tell us about those and how that fits into this larger project?
Yes. So in 1996, Adrian Rich is the guest editor. And I'm doing a little bit of guessing here. I'm like patching together the story based on Lehman's telling of it. So he's not a reliable narrator, but my understanding from Lehman's telling is that the Best American Poetry series becomes really popular in the poetry world in, in terms of poetry publishing. At most, it publishes around 10,000 copies a year, which in other genres would be, nothing. But for poetry, that's really good. So there's a lot of discussion about Lehman's anthology in the early 1990s. And Lehman says that Adrienne Rich, who is not a poet in his wheelhouse in any way, Adrienne Rich is a feminist, she's a lesbian, she's explicitly political. Adrienne Rich writes to David Lehman and has some qualms about the project. And Lehman whenever he tells stories like this of like being in conversation with his detractors, he always frames himself as sort of like a neutral facilitator, like
Oh,
just this
he's
professional
that guy.
objectivity. Hmm.
Yeah. Oh man.
Like yeah, sort of like the guy who's like, at the deciding the labor contract, the with your university, and he's like, these are just the decisions we have to make. Lehman then invites Rich to be guest editor, and she produces an iteration of the best American poetry, which, as Colin said, is really an outlier because of its commitments to race, gender, politics, and sexuality, and is kind of a corrective to Lehman's corrective project. In 1998, 2 years later, David Lehman organizes the what he calls the best of the best American poetry. So it's a 10th anniversary anthology, and he asks his friend Harold Bloom to be the guest editor of that iteration of the anthology. So it's an anthology of the anthology. Bloom is pulling poems from the first 10 iterations. And in his introduction to the best of the best American poetry, he famously says that he's refused to include any poems from 1 year of the anthology, although he does not say Adrian Rich's name. He
Huh.
won't even do that. But it's abundantly clear to everyone that that's who he's leaving out. And Bloom, in the introduction to the best American poetry, has this famous diatribe against the multiculturalists, and I forget the terms that he uses. It's like gender freaks, and that he's talking about French deconstruction, and all of the representatives of literary theory and identity politics and political correctness that Bloom, along with Lehman, see as threats to the hierarchies of great literature. And there's a really forceful response to this edition of the best American poetry, and specifically to Bloom's statements. And some African American poets really come out and say directly what's going on here. And very interestingly, Lehman responds to the controversy around the best of the best American poetry and Bloom's diatribe by being very happy that it has sold more books. So, and because he says, having learned the value of controversy from his work as a journalist after he quit academia and worked for Newsweek for about a decade, that this was really the purpose of stirring it up, was a kind of promotional logic.
Mm,
And it's good to sell books, especially
right.
if your anthology is being published by a big five conglomerate.
Just thinking by Lehman's logic, this is part of what it means to make poetry great again, right? This is, it needs to be able to move volumes. And so the controversy, the hatefulness of what Bloom said in his introduction, all of this is to the good of the art form from his perspective.
It is. And I think we can see Lehman through all of this as being pretty gleeful about all of this happening, and really, really, and never taking accountability. I mean, there's that moment where there's that controversy in the late 90s. And then again in 2014, there's another controversy that's organized around Lehman's racial politics, because in 2014, the Best American Poetry was guest edited by Terrence Hayes, who's a Black gay poet. And in Lehman's foreword, he cites at length this woman, I think her name is Heather McDonald, who is a member of a neoconservative, the Manhattan Policy Institute, which is a
Oh,
neoconservative think
yeah.
tank. And she is railing about the state of higher education and how gender and race are now like the primary criteria through which we like understand who students should be and who we should have in our institutions. He like quotes it at length. And as you're reading it, you're kind of like, whoa, this is like really weird to have this like huge block quote from this neoconservative think tank. I wonder what he'll say after it. And he just doesn't. Like it's a full just endorsement. And
Oof.
this resulted in this like really great interrogation of the anthology's Racial Politics in American Poetry Review. And the anthology series just kept going. And I think the one lesson that Lehman learned from it was that I shouldn't openly quote the neoconservatives that I agree with in the intros.
I'm curious to know, so we have these two editors, Adrian Rich, Terrence Haynes, who, their project seems, I mean, Lehman seems to think that their project is at odds with his, and that's why he's kind of trashing them in the introduction or trashing them in the anthology of the anthologies, right? Do you think his logic in inviting these guest editors to be guest editors is entirely about courting controversy, or is this also somehow involved with the logic of the production of the mainstream as well?
It's more the latter. I mean, what Lehman is really doing is laundering his reactionary ideology through this kind of these corridors of literary prestige so that his politics take on a kind of apolitical orthodoxy. And really interestingly, this is something that I didn't mention in the Defector piece either, because I think it's really complicated, is that after the best of the best American poetry and the controversy with Bloom, two of the other responses that I cite, along with Nikki Giovanni, are Rita Dove and Kevin Young, again, two Black American poets. And they have these really important critiques of Lehman. Both Dove and Young, after 1998, go on to be guest editors of editions of the best American poetry. I think that Lehman is being extremely strategic when he invites those poets to then become part of his project. And I would absolutely stop short of critiquing Dove and Young for accepting the invitation. At the same time, they are poets whose own prestige circulates through similar kind of literary marketplaces. And there's no doubt that it's advantageous to them in the same way that it was advantageous to Rich to take up the mantle of producing an iteration of this anthology. And within the channels of professionalization, those are the options that are available to poets of that stature. And so that's the work that you do.
In thinking about this, like the apolitical orthodoxy or the production of the mainstream, I'm reminded of something you told us in our pre-production meeting. So correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but members of the New York school had identities. So some of them were gay, some of them had class backgrounds that were not neutral middle class. And one of the things you told us about Lehman's project in writing his criticism was to take all of that away and present them as aesthetic craftspeople. And I hear a similar thing happening here, where the politics of these poets who are engaging political issues is taken away and replaced with this is simply a part of a wider aesthetic project where this stuff is irrelevant. It's no longer part of what's considered in their work, even though for them that's a very big part of what their work is.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So in Lehman's book on the New York School, which is called The Last Avant-Garde, The Making of the New York School of Poets, Lehman includes these four male poets, Ashbery, O'Hara, Koch, and Schuyler. He very intentionally does not include the one woman who is part of that community of poets, Barbara Guest. And when I was introduced to The Last Avant-Garde as a graduate student, it came along with the caveat that Lehman very problematically says, I'm not including Barbara Guest because she's just less important. Um,
Oh,
and he kind of goes out of his way to say this. The Last Avant-Garde is also problematic because it's bookended with these warnings against poetry being a tool for politics. It's very much like the rhetoric that's in the forwards to the best American poetry. So Lehman is One, removing any kind of question of feminism or like women's participation in the production of the category New York School. Three of the four male poets are also gay, and Lehman doesn't so much erase their queerness as he has to minimize and excuse it. And the canonizing function, like he wants to recast these deeply experimental American poets as being part of a kind of like Anglo-American transcendental capital R romantic tradition, all of which is part of this larger genre management project.
Um, we've been going for a while. Are there things we
Yeah,
haven't hit that you want to hit? Um,
man, there's one thing that I could just toss in, which is that Lehman also edits an anthology called The Best American Erotic Poems.
there,
Oh,
we just keep running into these creeps. I don't know what is going on, but it really just goes hand in hand. Sorry, that's all I have to say about it, but just
Yeah,
so many creeps in the bad art business.
yeah, yeah. It's a definitely a weird thing to have done. Yeah.
yeah.
And I guess maybe it's important to say, like, there is, while canon production can be deeply problematic and exclusionary, it can inflict a kind of erasure that is the equivalent of a cultural violence. Like, canonizing is also a natural gesture that's part of the literary field. Like I'm suggesting, like you can think of it as sorting, you can think of it as genre management, you can think of it as canonization. I think canonizing is just and categorization are natural outcomes of literary studies and of the professionalization of creative writing. We have to make choices about who we want to write in the wake of and emulate and be associated with. But Lehman's project in particular is worthy of our sustained critique because of how deeply commercial it is, how cynically attached it is to ideas of success that center his role as a facilitator of certain poets being elevated at the clear expense of other poets who he deems not worthy of being part of the field.
The thing that really stands out to me is how his effort to purify poetry through this anthology series, his effort to strip it of its political and ethical commitments, as you've shown, turns out to be like a really deeply reactionary political project.
I wish I had like a really quippy way to sum it all up, other than, I mean, Lehman, he does it actually in the gesture that precipitated me wanting to write this piece when I wrote it, which is what he says to the poet Bryony Janae at the 2025 launch reading when Bryony, at the beginning of their reading, says that in their heart they desire a free Palestine, that the next day Lehman emails them and says, and excoriates them, quote, for saying free Palestine and bringing politics into a night devoted to poetry, the best American poetry, and to me.
Wow. Yeah, I have the letter here, so I can read that for us. Dear Brian E. Janae, you read your poem well, and then, to my surprise, you said, quote, Free Palestine, introducing politics into an evening devoted to poetry, to the best American poetry, and to me. You then stormed out of the room. Your doing so was rude to all the poets who had not yet read. If you feel as you do about Gaza, you should rip up the check that I gave you, for the money comes from my pocket, and you probably do not want it known that you have accepted funds from a Jew and a Zionist. If you consider yourself a quote DEI hire, as you said, implying that Terrence Winch chose your poem not on its merits, but to fulfill some demographic imperative, you should not have agreed to participate. You have offended me. Sincerely, David Lehman. And then I have Bryony's response, which came on Instagram. So, David Lehman is offended. So much story to tell here. I was literally the only person of color in a room of about 50 plus people. I knew as soon as I walked into the space that I had fucked up, astronomically. which is honestly embarrassing. But I decided to stay, speak up, and then get the hell out of there. When I tell you my cortisol has been up since the reading, was literally calling on every ancestor I have to get me out of there safely. Anyways, shout out to my ancestors for helping me escape the mob. Poetry is great.
Yeah, yeah. There, it's hard to make a claim about why exactly the best American poetry is ending right now when it is. And one of the reasons has to do with exactly the issues that Bryony brings up directly and their ability to say it directly to Lehman's face, I think, is a confrontation that has needed to happen for a really long time. In the last 2 years, especially after the beginning of Israel's war on Gaza, Lehman has become more openly, his Zionism has been deeply problematic on social media. And there's a lot of anti-Muslim, anti-Islamic sentiment that's accompanied that Zionism. And he has been called out more openly for it on social media. And I think that the relevance of the best American poetry had waned along with increasing public awareness about how problematic Lehman is as a political actor. That's a theory about why he's stepping back when he's stepping back. But I think it's important to acknowledge that that Lehman is a kind of has been an open spokesperson for these ideas.
I actually think that's really interesting just to think about like social media and access to different channels of information. I'm not a social media utopianist. I try to stay off it as much as possible, but I do think if part of what you're telling us about is the politics of publication and the control of the big five in certain ways and the ways that after the 1980s the market collapsed and allowed this kind of consolidation, maybe there's some hope yet in the Instagram poets and everyone else being able to like create other things that just go in different directions and allow different creative worlds to open up.
I'm also thinking that, you know, Brian H. Nay's comments and the broader controversy are so instructive as to the persistence of that ethical imperative in poetry that as much as one can try to imagine and then create a version of poetry that is purely moral and purely about individuals, the very act of anthologizing is an act of bringing together a community, that to write and to read poetry is to be in relation with others. And it's impossible to erase those things from the art form.
Mm, yeah, that's absolutely something that I think Lehman has not reckoned with. He would be upset to hear you say that.
Good.
Nick, thanks so much. Like this has been like a fascinating conversation. I'm really glad you agreed to come on the show. It's been a pleasure having you. Listeners, you've been listening to Bad Art, a podcast about the politics of art in the 21st century. I'm Colin McLaughlin Alcock,
I'm Marielle Grushko.
and we've been joined today by Nick Sturm.
Yeah,
Pleasure
thank you
having
so
you.
much, Colin. Yeah, thank you, Mariel. It's been so much fun to think about American poetry with you on the pod.
Yeah, glad to have you. So that's going to be it for today. Thanks so much, and continue to follow us, like, listen, subscribe, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye.